Racist waitress spills soup on black elder. Not knowing he owns the chain, a kind elderly man's meal is ruined, but the waitress will soon find out that her actions may jeopardize her career. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The Monday morning rush at coffee and more on 7th Avenue moved at its usual frantic pace. Sarah Weber, a 28-year-old waitress with dark circles under her eyes, navigated between the packed tables while carrying 3 plates balanced precariously on her forearm. Her blonde hair, hastily tied in a messy bun, had several strands falling loose after 5 straight hours of nonstop service. During a brief moment between orders, Sarah pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she clicked on the photo of Lucas, her 6-year-old son. The image showed him smiling in his baseball uniform, taken just last weekend during his first Little League game. The custody battle with her ex-husband had been draining her savings and energy, making these double shifts necessary but exhausting. "Table 12 needs their order taken," shouted Marco, the shift supervisor, from behind the counter. Sarah quickly shoved her phone back in her apron pocket, grabbing her notepad and forcing a smile onto her tired face. The cafe buzzed with its usual mix of business people typing frantically on laptops, tourists consulting their maps, and regular customers reading their morning papers. Sarah moved between them with practiced efficiency, though her mind kept drifting to the stack of bills waiting at home and Lucas's upcoming school fees. At 11:30 a.m., the lunch crowd began flooding in, making the already hectic atmosphere even more challenging. Sarah's section filled up quickly, and she found herself juggling multiple orders while trying to maintain her professional demeanor. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted a heavy tray loaded with several bowls of hot soup. That's when it happened. As she turned toward table 15, her ankle twisted slightly on a napkin that had fallen to the floor. Sarah felt the tray tilt before she could correct it. The steaming bowl of tomato soup slid forward, its contents spilling directly onto the crisp, white shirt of an elderly customer who had been quietly reading his newspaper. The man, who would later be identified as Mr. Thompson, looked up from his now-ruined newspaper with an expression of quiet shock. His salt and pepper hair and well-tailored suit, now stained with red soup, suggested a man of means. But it was his calm demeanor that stood out most. No immediate outburst, just a steady gaze that made Sarah even more uncomfortable than if he had shouted. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so sorry," Sarah stammered, grabbing napkins from a nearby table and frantically trying to help clean up the mess. Her hands trembled more noticeably now, and sweat began forming on her forehead. The surrounding tables had gone quiet, all eyes focused on the unfolding scene. In her panic and embarrassment, Sarah's mouth ran ahead of her brain. "This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't spread your newspaper out so wide, taking up the whole table like you own the place," she blurted out, immediately regretting her words. But she didn't stop there. "People like you always think you can just come in here and act like you're better than everyone else, sitting alone at a 4-person table during rush hour." The reality of what she'd just said hit her like a slap in the face. She hadn't just insulted a customer. She'd made assumptions about him based solely on his appearance and age. The cafe had gone completely silent now, and Sarah could feel the disapproving stares from both customers and co-workers burning into her back. Mr. Thompson slowly folded what remained of his newspaper, his expression shifting from surprise to something more complex, a mixture of disappointment and contemplation. He didn't speak immediately, Wick. Somehow made the situation even more unbearable for Sarah. She stood frozen, clutching the wet napkins in her hands, aware that she had just crossed a line that could cost her more than just this job. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sound of cars honking outside and the hiss of the espresso machine. Sarah's mind raced through the potential consequences: termination, bad references, inability to pay her bills, losing custody of Lucas. All because she couldn't keep her prejudices in check during a moment of stress. Mr. Thompson placed both hands flat on the table and slowly rose to his full height. At 6 feet tall, he towered over Sarah, though his posture conveyed neither aggression nor intimidation. His soup-stained shirt clung to his chest, but he made no move to wipe it further. Instead, he focused his steady gaze directly on Sarah's face. "Young lady," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "I've sat in this cafe 3 times a week for the past 15 years. I've watched waiters and waitresses come and go. I've seen them during their best days and their worst." He paused, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "But this is the first time I've heard someone reveal so much about themselves in a single moment of frustration." Sarah's cheeks burned red. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Mr. Thompson raised his hand slightly, indicating he wasn't finished. The other customers remained silent, many now openly watching the exchange while pretending to focus on their meals or phones. "You see an old man taking up too much space," he continued, "but you don't see the person who's funded scholarship programs for underprivileged youth across this city. You see someone you think is entitled, without knowing I worked as a dishwasher in this very cafe 40 years ago." Marco, the shift supervisor, appeared beside Sarah, ready to intervene. "Mr. Thompson, I sincerely apologize for this incident. Sarah is still relatively new, and I assure you, that won't be necessary, Marco," Mr. Thompson interrupted, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "I believe this presents an opportunity." Sarah, finding her voice, jumped in defensively. "Listen, I didn't mean to come across as... I'm not. I have friends who are." She stumbled over her words, each attempt to justify herself only making things worse. The more she tried to prove she wasn't prejudiced, the more her own biases became apparent in her language and assumptions. Mr. Thompson's expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained intense. "You don't need to finish those sentences. I've heard them all before. Instead, I have a proposition for you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. The simple white card bore only his name and a phone number, no company affiliation or title. "I run a program," he explained, holding out the card. "It's a 6-week course that brings together people from all walks of life. We focus on understanding diversity, confronting our biases, and learning to see beyond our initial judgments. I'm offering you a spot in the next session." Sarah stared at the card but didn't take it. "Why would you offer me anything? I just ruined your clothes and insulted you in front of everyone." "Because," Mr. Thompson replied, "sometimes the people who need this opportunity the most are the ones who don't realize they need it. The program runs every Tuesday and Thursday evening from 6 to 8. I'm not asking you to come as a punishment. I'm offering you a chance to challenge yourself." Marco shifted uncomfortably beside them. "Sarah, your shift ends at 5:30. You could make it if you wanted to." The card remained suspended between them, a bridge between two worlds. Sarah thought about Lucas, about the example she wanted to set for him. She thought about the bills piling up at home and the custody battle looming ahead. This strange offer felt both, like a lifeline and a trap. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson smiled for the first time since the incident. "The catch is that you'll have to be honest with yourself. You'll have to examine beliefs you might not even realize you hold. It won't be comfortable, but nothing worth doing ever is." The cafe had begun to return to its normal rhythm, the tension of the moment breaking as customers returned to their conversations and meals. But for Sarah, standing there with soup still dripping from her apron, time seemed suspended between decision and consequence. Sarah sat in her small apartment that evening, staring at Mr. Thompson's business card on her kitchen table while Lucas slept in the next room. The card's edges were slightly bent from her nervous fidgeting. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her ex-husband, probably about another missed child support payment. The irony wasn't lost on her. She desperately needed to keep her job at the cafe, and now this strange opportunity had presented itself. After an hour of internal debate, she dialed the number. Mr. Thompson answered on the second ring, as if he'd been expecting her call. The program would start the following Tuesday at a community center 10 blocks from the cafe. "We're comfortable clothes," he said. "And Sarah, leave your assumptions at the door." Tuesday evening arrived faster than she'd hoped. Sarah had arranged for her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, to watch Lucas, promising to pay her when she could. The community center stood like a fortress before her, a brick building with unity through understanding painted above its entrance in fading letters. Inside, Sarah found herself in a room with 12 other participants. The diversity of the group immediately struck her. A young Muslim woman in a hijab sat next to a tattooed man who looked like he'd just left a construction site. An elderly Asian couple held hands in the corner, while a group of teenagers of various ethnicities clustered together near the water cooler. Sarah's instinct was to find someone who looked safe, someone like her. But there wasn't anyone who fit that description. Mr. Thompson entered the room exactly at 6 o'clock, wearing a fresh suit with no trace of soup stains. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had in the cafe. "Each of you is here because life has presented you with a moment of choice. Some of you chose to come. Others," he glanced at Sarah, "were given a gentle push." The first activity seemed simple enough. Everyone had to pair up with someone they'd never normally talk to. Sarah found herself facing James, a young black man with dreadlocks and kind eyes. He worked as a pediatric surgeon at the local hospital, a fact that made Sarah acutely aware of her own prejudices. She'd assumed, based on his appearance, that he worked in a more informal profession. "Now," Mr. Thompson instructed, "share a moment when you felt judged unfairly. Listen without interrupting. Don't try to justify or explain away the other person's experience." James went first. He spoke about being followed around in department stores, about doormen asking if he was making deliveries when he visited friends in upscale apartments, about mothers clutching their purses tighter when he entered elevators. His voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the weight of accumulated injuries in every word. When it was Sarah's turn, she struggled. I don't know if I've ever really been judged unfairly," she admitted. "I mean, people sometimes assume I'm not smart because I'm a waitress," but she trailed off, realizing how trivial her examples sounded compared to James's daily experiences. "That's okay," James said, surprising her with his gentleness. "Recognition is the first step. We all have different starting points in this journey." The evening continued with more exercises, each designed to push participants out of their comfort zone. During a break, Sarah overheard two teenagers discussing their experiences with bullying. One for being gay, the other for being dyslexic. Their stories made her think about Lucas and the world he would grow up in. What unconscious biases was she passing on to him? As the session ended, Mr. Thompson pulled Sarah aside. "How are you feeling?" "Overwhelmed," she admitted. "I thought I knew who I was, but tonight made me question everything. How can I be so blind to my own prejudices?" "The fact that you're asking that question means you're already changing," he replied. "See you Thursday?" Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with new perspectives and uncomfortable truths. On her walk home, she passed the cafe where everything had started. Through the window, she could see customers of all backgrounds sharing meals and conversations. She'd looked at that scene hundreds of times before, but tonight, for the first time, she really saw it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's participation in the program became more active. She found herself raising her hand during discussions, sharing perspectives she'd never voiced before. The cafe's morning rush no longer seemed as chaotic. She learned to see each customer as an individual with their own struggles rather than an obstacle to overcome. During one particularly intense session, the group discussed microaggressions. Sarah listened as Maria, the Muslim woman she'd noticed on the first day, described how people often spoke slower to her, assuming she didn't understand English well, despite her being born and raised in Brooklyn. The story hit close to home. Sarah remembered doing the same thing to customers she perceived as foreign. "I used to think I was being helpful," Sarah admitted to the group. "But now I realize I was just making assumptions based on how people looked. Last week, I caught myself about to do it again with a customer wearing a sari. I stopped, introduced myself normally, and found out she's a professor of English literature at Columbia." Mr. Thompson, who had been quietly observing from the corner, nodded approvingly. He'd taken to checking on Sarah during her shifts at the cafe, ordering his usual soup, though now she was careful not to spill it, and offering subtle guidance. His presence had become oddly comforting, filling a void left by her own father's absence. "You're making progress," he told her one afternoon. "But remember, this journey isn't just about changing behaviors. It's about understanding why we held those beliefs in the first place." Sarah was about to respond when her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed her ex-husband's name. Her stomach dropped. He only called during work hours when he wanted to cause trouble. Excusing herself, she took the call in the cafe's back alley. "I'm filing for full custody." Mark's voice crackled through the speaker. "You're working double shifts, staying out late for some program. That's not a stable environment for Lucas. My lawyer thinks we have a strong case." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah leaned against the brick wall, her free hand pressing against her chest as if to keep her heart from exploding. "Mark, please. You know I'm working these shifts to make ends meet. The program, it's making me a better person, a better mother. Save it for the judge," he sneered. "You can't even afford a decent lawyer. Face it, Sarah, you're not winning this one." After he hung up, Sarah slid down the wall until she sat on the cold concrete. Her uniform would get dirty, but she couldn't bring herself to care. Tears streamed down her face as she considered the cruel irony. Just as she was learning to be more understanding of others, she might lose the one person who mattered most. Mr. Thompson found her there 10 minutes later. He didn't say anything at first, just offered her his handkerchief, a genuine cloth one, monogrammed with his initials. The simple gesture of kindness broke something in Sarah and SH. He found herself telling him everything. The bitter divorce, the custody battle, her struggles to provide for Lucas while working minimum wage jobs. "Life has a way of testing us just when we're making progress," he said finally. "But consider this. Maybe these challenges aren't meant to break you. Maybe they're opportunities to apply what you're learning in ways you never expected." Sarah wiped her eyes, confused. "What do you mean?" "You're learning to see beyond surface judgments, to understand different perspectives," he explained. "Perhaps those same skills could help you navigate this situation with your ex-husband. Understanding doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, but it might help you find solutions you haven't considered." As her shift ended that evening, Sarah couldn't shake Mr. Thompson's words. She watched the diverse crowd of customers, each with their own unseen battles, and realized that even Mark, despite his threats, was probably acting from a place of fear. Fear of losing connection with his son. Fear of not being in control. The revelation didn't make her situation any less precarious, but it gave her a new perspective. If she could learn to see beyond her prejudices in the program, maybe she could also find a way to transform this challenge into an opportunity for growth. 3 days after Mark's threatening call, Sarah approached her manager, Diana, with a proposal clutched in her trembling hands. She'd spent 2 nights drafting it after Lucas went to bed, drawing on everything she'd learned in Mr. Thompson's program. A diversity night at the cafe? Diana raised an eyebrow, scanning the document. "Sarah, we're a business, not a community center." "That's exactly why we should do it," Sarah pressed on, surprising herself with her confidence. "Our customers come from every background imaginable, but we've never really celebrated that. We could have an evening of cultural exchange, food, stories, music. It could bring the community together and boost business." Diana drummed her fingers on her desk. "And this has nothing to do with the incident with Mr. Thompson?" "It has everything to do with it," Sarah admitted, "but not in the way you think. That moment showed me how much I needed to change. Now I want to help create positive change for others too." The manager studied Sarah's face for a long moment. "Write up a detailed plan. Budget, logistics, everything. If it's solid, we'll consider it." Sarah threw herself into the planning with an intensity that surprised her coworkers. During breaks, she approached regular customers from different backgrounds, asking if they'd be willing to participate. Many agreed enthusiastically, but others met her with skepticism. "Why should we trust you?" asked Mrs. Chun, a regular who'd witnessed the soup incident. "Last month you made fun of my accent when you thought I couldn't hear you." The accusation stung, particularly because Sarah knew it was true. "You're right," she said, swallowing her pride. "I was wrong, and I'm trying to do better. This event isn't about pretending prejudice doesn't exist. It's about acknowledging it and working to change it." Her honesty seemed to touch something in Mrs. Chun. "I will think about it," she said finally. Not everyone was supportive. Several of her fellow servers complained about the extra work the event would create. "This isn't going to change anything," sneered Jake, a longtime waiter. "People are who they are. You're just doing this to save face after your little racist moment." Sarah felt her old defensiveness rising, but remembered Mr. Thompson's teachings about handling resistance. "Maybe you're right that people don't change easily," she replied calmly. "But shouldn't we at least try?" As the weeks passed, the event began taking shape. Mr. Thompson helped connect her with community leaders who could contribute. The local synagogue offered to provide traditional Jewish dishes. A nearby mosque volunteered performers for tea, traditional Islamic music. The LGBT Center promised to send representatives to share their stories. The logistics proved challenging. Sarah juggled vendor agreements, performance schedules, and seating arrangements while still working her regular shifts and attending program sessions. Some nights she collapsed in a bed fully clothed, too exhausted to change. But whenever she felt like giving up, she thought of Lucas watching her, learning from her example. One evening, as she was putting up posters advertising the event, she overheard two customers talking. "Can you believe they're doing this? It's just PC culture gone mad," one said. "This used to be a normal cafe." The old Sarah would have either ignored them or lashed out. Instead, she approached their table. "I couldn't help overhearing your concerns," she said. "Would you be willing to tell me more about what bothers you about the event? I'm genuinely interested in understanding your perspective." The conversation that followed wasn't easy, but it was productive. While they didn't end up agreeing, both customers appreciated being heard rather than dismissed. One even took a flyer, promising to think about it. As the day of the event approached, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She'd put everything into this: her time, her energy, her growing understanding of diversity and inclusion. If it failed, she knew the critics would see it as proof that such efforts were pointless. If it succeeded, it might show that real change was possible, even in a small cafe in New York City. The night before the event, Mr. Thompson stayed late after closing to help with final preparations. "Are you ready?" he asked, watching her arrange chairs for the 100th time. "No saran serdanistli, but I'm going to do it anyway." The morning of the event, Sarah arrived 2 hours early, her hands shaking as she unlocked the cafe's front door. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night rehearsing her opening speech and worrying about everything that could go wrong. Lucas had sensed her anxiety that morning, giving her an extra tight hug before heading to school. "You're going to do great, Mom," he'd said, showing wisdom beyond his years. By 5 p.m., the cafe had been transformed. Tables were arranged in a semicircle, creating an intimate space for performances and discussions. Food stations lined the walls, featuring dishes from over a dozen cultures. The smell of Indian curry mingled with Mexican tamales and Korean bulgogi. Signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors, and a small stage had been set up in the corner. At 5:30, people began arriving. Sarah's heart sank when she saw some familiar faces, customers she'd offended over the past year with her thoughtless comments and assumptions. Mrs. Chun came with her entire family. The professor in the sari she'd nearly talked down to weeks ago arrived with several colleagues. Even the two men who'd criticized the event were there, looking uncomfortable but present. "Deep breaths," Mr. Thompson whispered, appearing beside her. He wore a simple black suit tonight, different from his usual business attire. "Remember why you're doing this." At 6 p.m. sharp, Sarah approached the microphone. The cafe was packed, with people standing wherever they could find space. Her prepared speech felt suddenly inadequate, so she set it aside. 3 months ago, she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I stood right there." She pointed to the spot where she'd spilled soup on Mr. Thompson and showed everyone the worst version of myself. "I made assumptions about people based on how they looked, talked, or dressed. I thought I wasn't prejudiced because I never used obvious slurs or acted with outright hostility. But prejudice isn't always about hatred. Sometimes it's about the small ways we dismiss or diminish others without even realizing it." The room had gone completely silent. Sarah could feel every eye on her, but she continued. "I'm not standing G here tonight, claiming I'm completely changed. I'm still learning, still catching myself making assumptions. But I've learned that the first step toward real change is acknowledging our mistakes and being willing to listen to others' experiences." She gestured to the diverse crowd. "Look around this room. Every person here has a story of being judged, dismissed, or misunderstood. Tonight, we're creating a space to share those stories, to listen without judgment, and maybe to begin seeing each other as full human beings rather than walking stereotypes. What followed was more powerful than Sarah could have imagined. A young Muslim woman shared her experience of removing her hijab for fear of discrimination, then finding the courage to wear it again. An elderly gay couple talked about hiding their relationship for decades before finally feeling safe enough to be open. A black businessman described how he still got pulled over driving his luxury car in certain neighborhoods. Between stories, there were performances, traditional dances, music, poetry. People who came in as strangers began talking, sharing food, and exchanging contact information. Even Jake, the skeptical waiter, was seen deep in conversation with Mrs. Chen's teenage son about their shared love of gaming. The highlight came when Mr. Thompson took the stage. Few people knew him beyond his regular appearances at the cafe, but his presence commanded attention. He spoke about growing up poor in segregated Alabama, about fighting for equal rights in the 60s, and about his journey from dishwasher to successful businessman. But success isn't just about making money, he said, looking directly at Sarah. It's about using whatever influence you have to create positive change. Sometimes that change starts with something as simple as admitting you were wrong and trying to do better. As the evening wound down, Sarah noticed something remarkable. People weren't rushing to leave. They lingered, continuing conversations, exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet again. The cafe had become more than just a place to get coffee. It had transformed into a genuine community space. The morning after the event, Sarah arrived at the cafe expecting everything to return to normal. Instead, she found a line of people waiting outside before opening time. Some were regulars, others had attended the event, and many were new faces who'd heard about it through social media. Customers had posted videos and photos that had gone viral overnight. "Did you see the local news coverage?" Diana asked, holding up her phone to show Sarah a clip. The headline read, "Local cafe transforms mistake into movement." The reporter highlighted how a single incident of bias had evolved into a community-building initiative. Sarah's stomach tightened seeing herself on screen, but the story focused more on the event's impact than her past transgression. Throughout the day, Sarah noticed subtle but significant changes. Customers who had never acknowledged each other were greeting one another by name. Mrs. Chen's family had brought traditional Chinese pastries to share with the staff. The professor in the sari now held her weekly faculty meetings at the cafe, bringing diverse groups of students and colleagues. But not everything was positive. Some regular customers stopped coming, leaving notes complaining that the cafe had become too political. One morning, Sarah found a crude note taped to the door. "Go back to serving coffee and stop pushing your agenda." She removed it before anyone else could see it, but the words stung. During her break, Sarah checked her phone and found several missed calls from Lucas's school. Her heart racing, she called back immediately. The principal explained that Lucas had gotten into an argument with another student who had made racist comments about his friend. Instead of fighting, Lucas had tried to explain what his mom had taught him about prejudice and understanding. Our son handled it remarkably well," the principal said. "He suggested they come to your cafe to learn more about different cultures." Sarah felt tears welling up. Her journey wasn't just changing her anymore. It was affecting her son's worldview. That afternoon, Mr. Thompson sat at his usual table, watching Sarah work. She moved differently now, with more confidence, but also more awareness. When an elderly couple struggled with the menu, she didn't automatically assume they needed things explained slowly. When a group of teenagers in religious attire came in, she treated them like any other customers, not with the exaggerated carefulness she might have shown before. "You've come a long way," Mr. Thompson observed during a quiet moment. "But I sense something still bothering you." Sarah glanced around the cafe before responding. "I'm proud of the changes we've made here, but sometimes I feel like a fraud. People are praising me for organizing the event, but they don't know how I used to think and act. Some of them were victims of my prejudice, and they don't even remember." Mr. Thompson considered this. "That guilt you're feeling? It's part of the process. The question is, what will you do with it?" Before Sarah could answer, a customer at another table interrupted. "Excuse me, aren't you the waitress who made those racist comments a few months ago? I was here that day." The speaker was a middle-aged woman with a stern expression. Other customers turned to listen. Sarah felt her face flush, but she stood her ground. Yes, that was me. I made assumptions and said things I deeply regret. I'm not that person anymore, but I don't deny that I was. The woman's expression softened slightly. My daughter saw the video from your event. She's dealing with discrimination at her school. Would you be willing to talk to her group about your experience? About how people can change? The request caught Sarah off guard. Her past wasn't just following her. It was transforming into something unexpected. As she looked around the cafe, she saw not just customers but a community in progress, still imperfect but striving to be better. I would be honored, she replied, realizing that her journey of change was far from over. It was evolving into something larger than herself. A week after the event, Sarah received an email from Diana requesting a meeting the following morning. The message was brief and formal, offering no hints about its purpose. That night, Sarah barely slept, her mind cycling through possibilities, from promotion to termination. The cafe's transformation had brought attention they hadn't anticipated, and not all of it was welcome. When Sarah arrived for the morning meeting, she found not just Diana, but also two representatives from the cafe's corporate office. Their presence made her pulse quicken. The conference room, usually used for staff meetings, felt suddenly small and airless. Sarah, we've been monitoring the situation closely, began the older of the two corporate representatives, introducing himself as Richard Barnes, Regional Director. The event you organized has attracted significant attention to our brand. We've received hundreds of emails and social media mentions. Diana slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed screenshots. Some were glowing reviews praising the cafe's initiative. Others were angry messages threatening boycotts. One particular comment caught Sarah's eye. First, they hire racist servers, then they try to cover it up with diversity propaganda. Your transformation appears genuine, the second corporate representative added. But some customers have expressed concerns about your continued employment given your past behavior. They've been circulating the video of the soup incident. Sarah's hands clenched under the table. I understand their concerns, she said carefully. I can't erase what I did, but I can show through my actions that people can learn and change. Diana cleared her th. Do what? That's actually why we're here. Corporate wants to know how to handle this situation. Some board members suggest a transfer to another location might be best. Give you a fresh start. The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. A transfer would mean leaving the community she'd helped build, abandoning the relationships she'd worked to repair. It would also mean longer commutes to Lucas's school, making her custody situation even more precarious. There's also the matter of certain customers, Richard continued. Mr. Davidson, one of our most loyal patrons, has complained that the cafe's new political stance makes him uncomfortable. He spends considerable money here. Sarah thought about Mr. Davidson. She knew exactly who he was. He'd made subtle racist comments for years, but everyone had always ignored them because of his wealth and influence. The old Sarah would have stayed quiet, prioritizing job security over principle. With all due respect, she said, surprising herself with her steady voice. If Mr. Davidson is uncomfortable with a cafe that welcomes everyone equally, perhaps we should be questioning his values rather than our progress. A tense silence followed her words. Diana's expression was unreadable, but Sarah noticed a slight smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. That's precisely the kind of response we were testing for, Richard said finally. We needed to see if your change was genuine or just damage control. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The second corporate representative pulled out another document. We're actually here to discuss expanding the diversity initiative to other locations. We believe you've created something valuable here, something that could benefit our entire chain. Relief flooded through Sarah, quickly followed by new anxiety. But some customers are still unhappy, she pointed out. The complaints, the threats. Change makes people uncomfortable, Diana said. But discomfort often precedes growth. Your event showed us that addressing these issues head-on, while risky, can strengthen our community and our business. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. The corporate recognition was validating, but it also brought new pressures. Could she help replicate this transformation at other locations while still maintaining the authentic, community-driven spirit that made it successful? Outside the conference room, Diana pulled her aside. "Just so you know, Mr. Davidson came in yesterday while you were off. He left this." She handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was a letter of apology for his past behavior and a request to help him understand how he could do better. Later that week, Mr. Thompson invited Sarah to meet him at a small park near the cafe. It was unusual. They normally talked during his regular visits or after program sessions. When she arrived, she found him sitting on a bench, looking more serious than usual. "Things are about to get more complicated," he said without preamble. "Have you checked your email today?" Sarah pulled out her phone and found a message from a law firm representing someone named Michael Reeves. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. The email detailed intentions to file a lawsuit against both her and the cafe, claiming emotional distress and hostile work environment from the diversity event. "Michael Reeves," Mr. Thompson said, noting her confusion. "He worked at the cafe about 8 months ago. He was fired for making discriminatory remarks to customers." The memory clicked into place. Mike had been a senior server, terminated after multiple complaints about his behavior toward minority customers. Sarah remembered how he'd encouraged her subtle biases back then, laughing at her snide comments and teaching her coded language to use when discussing certain customers. "He's claiming the event was a personal attack on him," Mr. Thompson explained. "That it was organized specifically to Shah, me, him, and others who share his views. He's gathered statements from some disgruntled customers to support his case." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. But that's not true. The event wasn't about attacking anyone. It was about bringing people together, about learning from each other. "You and I know that," Mr. Thompson said gently. "But Michael's lawyer is arguing that by publicly addressing prejudice in the cafe's history, you created a narrative that damaged his reputation and career prospects." Sarah's phone buzzed with another email, this time from a local news outlet requesting an interview about the lawsuit. They're calling it "Diversity Event Sparks Backlash. Former employee claims discrimination against traditional values." Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his expression intense. "Sarah, there's something you need to understand about this situation. Michael isn't acting alone. There are people who see movements toward inclusion as a threat to their power. They're using him to try to discourage other businesses from following your example." "How do you know all this?" Sarah asked, suddenly realizing how much information Mr. Thompson seemed to have. He smiled slightly. "Because I've dealt with similar resistance throughout my career. What you see as a simple cafe owner who spills soup on is actually the CEO of Thompson Enterprises. We own several major companies, and we've been pushing for diversity initiatives for years. The same groups backing Michael's lawsuit have opposed our corporate inclusion programs." Sarah sat back, stunned. The kind elderly man who turned her mistake into an opportunity for growth was actually a powerful business leader. It explained his influence, the program's resources, his careful guidance of her transformation. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Would it have made a difference?" he countered. "Would you have learned the same lessons if you'd known who I was from the start?" Sometimes the most important growth happens when we're not trying to impress anyone. Sarah thought about this as she watched children playing in the park. One group, diverse in every way imaginable, was organizing a game of tag, naturally figuring out how to include everyone who wanted to play. "What do we do about the lawsuit?" she finally asked. "We fight it," Mr. Thompson replied firmly. "Not just for you or the cafe, but for every business trying to create positive change. My legal team is already preparing a response. But Sarah, you need to be ready. This will make you even more visible. Your story will be scrutinized. Every part of your past will be examined." Sarah thought about Lucas, about her custody battle, about all the progress she'd made. "I'm not hiding anymore," she said. "If telling my story honestly can help others understand that change is possible, then that's what I'll do." Mr. Thompson nodded approvingly. "Just remember, this isn't just about winning a lawsuit. It's about showing that the path to inclusion, though challenging, is worth fighting for." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters the morning of the hearing. Sarah, dressed in a borrowed suit from Diana, clutched a folder containing testimonials from cafe customers and participants in the diversity event. Mr. Thompson stood beside her, his presence providing silent support as cameras flashed around them. Inside the courtroom, Michael Reeves sat with his legal team, looking smaller than Sarah remembered. His lawsuit had evolved into a full hearing about discrimination, not against him, as he claimed, but about the broader implications of workplace diversity initiatives. The proceedings began with Michael's testimony. He painted a picture of himself as a victim of reverse discrimination, claiming the cafe had become hostile to traditional values. His lawyer presented carefully selected social media posts and comments from customers who felt alienated by the changes. Ms. Weber's event, his lawyer argued, was nothing more than a public shaming disguised as progress, targeting those who hold different views. My client's termination and the subsequent diversity celebration have caused him significant emotional and professional damage. When Sarah's turn came, she walked to the witness stand with steady steps. The previous night, she'd sat with Lucas, explaining why this was important. Sometimes, honey, she'd told him, doing the right thing means facing our mistakes in public. Could you describe the incident that led to the diversity initiative? Her lawyer asked. Sarah looked directly at the judge. I could tell you about spilling soup on Mr. Thompson, about my racist remarks, about my prejudices. But what's more important is what happened after. I learned that change isn't just possible, it's necessary. The event wasn't about shame or exclusion. It was about creating a space where everyone could feel valued. The turning point came when Mr. Thompson took the stand. As he identified himself as the CEO of Thompson Enterprises, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Michael's lawyer seemed to physically deflate. I could have filed a complaint against Ms. Weber that day, Mr. Thompson testified. Instead, I saw an opportunity for transformation. What happened at that cafe isn't just about one person or one incident. It's about the possibility of change, about a community's capacity to grow. He then revealed documents showing that Michael's lawsuit was being funded by a group known for opposing diversity initiatives across the country. They're using this case to discourage other businesses from following the cafe's example, he explained. They want to make inclusion seem legally risky. The judge, who had been taking careful notes throughout, finally spoke. Mr. Reeves, do you maintain that your termination was unjust? Michael shifted uncomfortably. I was fired for speaking my mind. According to these records, the judge continued, you were fired for multiple documented instances of discriminatory behavior toward customers after several warnings. The diversity event occurred months later. How do you connect these events? The case unraveled quickly after that. The judge not only dismissed Michael's lawsuit, but issued a strongly worded opinion supporting the cafe's initiatives. In a diverse society, she wrote, businesses not only have the right, but perhaps the responsibility to create inclusive environments. This case demonstrates that addressing bias through education and community building is not discrimination, it is progress. Outside the courthouse, Sarah found herself surrounded by supporters, cafe customers, program participants, even some former critics who'd come to understand the importance of the changes. Lucas ran to hug her, having watched the proceedings with Mrs. Rodriguez. Mr. Thompson approached with a surprise announcement. The board has approved the creation of a foundation, he said, dedicated to helping businesses implement diversity programs. Sarah, we'd like you to lead it. Sarah looked at Lucas, then at the diverse group of people around her, her cafe family. On one condition, she said, the foundation's first project has to be a scholarship program for single parents. Because sometimes people just need a chance to prove they can change. That evening, the cafe hosted a celebration. As Sarah watched people from all walks of life sharing food, stories, and laughter, she remembered the person she'd been just months ago. The journey hadn't been easy, and she knew there would be more challenges ahead. But looking at Lucas proudly showing his friends around the cafe, she understood that true change ripples outward, touching lives in ways we can never predict. The soup stain on Mr. Thompson's suit had long since faded, but its impact had permanently altered the fabric of their community. Sometimes, Sarah realized, our worst moments can lead to our best transformations if we're brave enough to embrace the change.